I think we've got a good group here. I'm Lizzie Wyant. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm actually going to turn it over, I think, to our Executive Director, Mark Drayson, who will help kick off this event.
Lizzie, thank you very, very much. And thanks to Rep. Meschino and to Senator Crighton for being present today and for helping to lead and sponsor this effort. I also want to thank on my staff, Lizzie and the entire government affairs team, my deputy director, Rebecca Davis, and our two presenters, Betsy Cowan-Neptune and Sarah Philbrick from the Economic Development Division and Data Services Department, respectively. I feel lately in all the conversations that I'm having, there are almost no more important discussions to have than the issue of return to work, getting back to the so-called new normal, figuring out what our recovery economy is even going to mean and how we're going to implement it. And over again, I find that one of the issues we're facing is, are we going to implement it? Are we going to make certain things happen? Or are we just going to let it happen to us? I think that people often sort of despair of this fact and they say, well, things are going to be as they're going to be. The feds will decide, the market will decide, things will happen, we'll go back to what we used to have before. But I don't think that's the case. And I don't think it has to be the case, especially with the legislature. Folks in the legislature have a lot of power, a lot of authority, not only through their ability to pass laws, but through the bully pulpit, through their ability to lead opinion. And I certainly know that's what Joan and Brendan intend to do. And I think many of the other legislators and staff who are joining us here today, we do have some control over it. And we know there are some important things that we have to address. We have to address that this pandemic has been extraordinarily inequitable in terms of its impact on women, and particularly women of color. We saw even in the last jobs report that came out a few days ago, which was disappointing overall, although we shouldn't take a 1 month report to mean too much. But once again, we saw in that report that women were not even returning to the workforce at the same pace as men. The impact of the pandemic itself was terribly inequitable in terms of its impact on people of color, not only from the perspective of the illness, but also from the perspective of unemployment. And we saw that many of our programs, especially some of our federal programs, while they did a lot to help people, they had a lot of holes in them as well. They couldn't serve undocumented workers, for example. And another thing we should have control over is my 17-year-old son, who's making a lot of noise with the ice tray behind me, over which I have relatively little control, actually. Could you quiet down in there, Sam? There we go. So faced with those inequities, it's really important to try and craft legislation, to craft priorities to the expenditure of ARPA money and hopefully infrastructure money that will actually focus on redressing some of those inequities, change some of the things that we're dissatisfied with in our society and dissatisfied with based on the evidence that we saw in the course of the pandemic. And I know that many of the folks on this webinar can in fact do just that and are committed to doing just that. So if our help in the provision of data, providing analysis, helping with drafting legislation or policy ideas, if that can help our colleagues and friends in the legislature to move forward on some of these issues, then I know that every day that we come into work will have been worth it. And we are all available to help in that endeavor in any way that we can. So with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Lizzie. Is that right? No? Who do you want me to turn? You turn it over to the next person.
I think we're turning it over to our sponsors to say a few words to welcome us today. So, Rep. Meschino, Senator Crighton.
Senator, I'm going to let you go first because you are the one with the time constraints.
Thank you, Rep. Meschino. We just jumped into Senate caucus. We have a budget coming out today, so I may have to jump, but I just want to say thank you to Mark, to Lizzie, to everyone at the MAPC for hosting this important event, but more importantly for all the work you've done, throughout my time in the building, certainly as a staffer for then Senator McGee, as a city councilor even in Lynn. You were tremendously helpful, and obviously now as a rep and now a senator. Your work has really helped influence policy throughout my time here, and I'm excited to learn more and to participate more in your regional plan, which I know you'll be updating, the MetroCommon 2050, and encourage certainly any legislators on the call, staff, any constituents to participate as much as you can in the planning process. As Mark had said, and I don't want to repeat too much, he said it much more eloquently than I can, but as we work towards a strong and equitable recovery from Massachusetts, we must not lose sight of the ways that the pandemic has already changed our society and the inequities that it's laid bare. The changing nature of work and travel patterns offers an opportunity to make sure that more people throughout the Commonwealth have equal access to economic opportunity. I think just as much as there's opportunity, we also need to not let the pandemic and the uncertainty around it delay any of the actions that we know are right to make a more equitable society. You know, certainly when we think of housing and transportation and the environment, you know, prior to the pandemic, we had made commitments to act on these. And while we do want to take a deep dive in these issues and really study it, we can't afford to wait. And I certainly feel a sense of urgency as a legislator. I'm sure many of the folks on this call do, to act on these issues that the MAPC has been highlighting for years and that we all know are the right and urgent things that we need to be focusing on. So with that, I would also like to say thank you to the Senate President, who this session had created a Senate Special Committee on Reimagining Massachusetts, which is going to dive into a ton of these issues, and to its chairman, Adam Hines, who you couldn't have a brighter guy, a more energetic guy tackle these issues. And I know he's already doing great work with the committee, but certainly look forward to working with that committee as well as our great colleagues in the House. And you know, honored to turn it over back to Rep. Joan Meschino, who I've worked with for many years in the Beaches Commission and other things, and just a tremendous leader on all the issues that I just mentioned here. So thank you again, and sorry I have to jump, but look forward to working with you on this important initiative.
Thank you, Senator Crighton. And thank you for the kind words. We've known each other a long time, and it's just absolutely a pleasure to work with you. And I just want to thank MAPC for thinking of me to help you kick this off and host this briefing today. I actually think that MAPC is uniquely qualified to lead in this space on this topic and at this moment. And I hope that I can recommend to all of my colleagues and your wonderful, fabulous staff that MAPC is truly a trusted resource. I'm hopefully you've all had a chance to browse through the MetroCommon 2050 documents. There were some links in the emails that we all circulated to you in advance that lead you to, I think there's 18 key points, key recommendations, key spaces that MAPC is speaking to you. But the reason I mention it at this moment is because this work is ongoing work over decades. And this is a refresh. It's always about the refresh, making sure that it's relevant, timely, current. And it is most importantly grounded in what our regions and our municipalities need. It's informed by a very local sort of input and robust public process. I have participated 3 times myself. So I can tell you that not only is it interesting and engaging and fun, it also comes out with a great, always with a great set of recommendations, and always with an equity lens, which I think is particularly important. As I said, you know, MAPC is really uniquely positioned at this moment. This is an organization, our regional planner, that has been looking at the pre-pandemic trends that were leading up to this moment and is now assessing all of that in the context of the pandemic impacts. But I think the more important piece is that these are thought leaders, not just on the larger planning issues. Everything I think I know about planning, I have learned from MAPC, and mostly I think I get it right. But more to the point, they make it very accessible, and as thought leaders, they make it very digestible, and they make it very relevant to us. And as this is going to be, unfortunately, thanks to the pandemic, we are going to be the recipients of a transformative, once in a generation investment in our infrastructure. This is our chance to get it right on the economic recovery. And I think as political leaders, as leaders in our local communities and on the state level, and quite frankly, people look to us on the national level as well. You know, I think we have a real opportunity not just to think about how to get federal dollars down to our Main Street economies and the sort of the economic recovery. We also have the ability to think about these things relative to recent changes, climate change, and all of the work that we've been doing and putting policy in place to make sure that the green economy is part of our larger economic recovery. We are very fortunate to have these folks. They're experienced, they have expertise, they have knowledge, and they have amazing data. So if you take nothing else away from my remarks today, when you're thinking about these thoughts yourself, they're a great source to go to for both ideas and trends, but also data. And as I said, they are uniquely positioned to operate at that intersection of the local, the regional, and the state, but also across silos. So without further ado, I will turn it back over to our friends at MAPC to kick off, and just want to thank Mark and his team for all of their fabulous work and helping to inform good policy on Beacon Hill.
Thank you so much, Rep. I really appreciate that. We love working with you. I just want to take a quick second before I turn it over to my colleagues and thank, I see a number of reps have joined us in the room. I see Rep Capano, Rep Gentile, Rep Mira, Rep McMurtry, Rep Owens, and I think Rep Barber just joined. So thank you all so much for being here. And obviously, so many of the staff that are here, we really appreciate you taking out the time to join us today. We know how much you work and how much you hold up the building and let us do the work that we do. So we're really glad that you're here as well. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleagues, Sarah Philbrick and Betsy Cowan, who are gonna walk through some of the research and fabulous data that they're mentioned on sort of how we're thinking about future of work. And I will just say, please feel free to put questions that you have in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that and we'll go through that in the Q&A.
Thanks, Lizzie, and thank you all for being here. I know it sounds like a busy week, and I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the things that we've been thinking about at MAPC. My name is Sarah Philbrick. I'm a senior research analyst at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and today Betsy and I are going to talk to you about what we've been thinking about for the future of work, how the pandemic has impacted workers in Massachusetts, and ways that we can plan for a more equitable and resilient recovery. As the rep mentioned, the legislature will be positioned to make a lot of important decisions. And as Mark mentioned, there are lots of federal recovery dollars coming our way in the future. And so hopefully this presentation can help us think about where we need to target that money. So the Metropolitan Area Planning Council is one of 13 regional planning agencies in Massachusetts. We're highlighted in green here, and every municipality in Massachusetts is served by a regional planning agency. MAPC itself has 101 member municipalities, and we serve nearly half of the state's residents. So I really want to talk about the way that COVID-19 has impacted workers in Massachusetts. Mark brought up some of the ways that the pandemic has impacted undocumented workers and women, but I'm going to pull out a few key points that hopefully summarize all the data you've been seeing over the past year coming across your desk. This first chart shows the weekly continued unemployment claims by race in Massachusetts. And one of the first things that we see is the chart starts in January of 2020. We see this huge balloon of unemployment claims that were filed last March. But one thing I want to point out in this chart is not the sheer number of unemployment claims we've seen over the past year, but the changing share of people of color who have made up these claims. So white folks made up nearly 80% of claims before the pandemic, and as the pandemic has continued, have made up a declining share of claims, indicating that this pandemic has been hardest on people of color in our region, which is not a surprise, but the data does show that. And even as we sort of go into recovery, you see the number of unemployment claims has been declining pretty rapidly since the summer. We're not seeing that change in the percentage of people of color who are making up these claims. Another really key point I want to hit home about the pandemic and its impact on workers is that this pandemic has impacted low-income workers the most. This chart shows the change in employment by wage level since January of 2020. Our state has actually gained some jobs in those who make the highest wages, over $60,000 a year, but we've lost nearly half of low wage jobs in that time. And that unemployment data I just showed you doesn't really show this. It looks like unemployment rates are declining. It looks like things are getting back to normal, but we know that some folks have had to leave the labor force either to take care of children or older adults or for other reason. We've also had people who are just no longer eligible for unemployment insurance anymore. They sort of ran out of their time. And so there are lots of jobs that we're still missing that we're not seeing in those unemployment claims, particularly at this lowest end of wages. And again, as Mark mentioned, this pandemic has been hardest on women and women of color. This is partially due to the types of jobs that were impacted most by the pandemic: service work, hotel work, which are primarily or more represented by women of color, but also the pandemic is forcing people to make decisions about how they spend their time when they can't have professional help, especially about childcare and elder care. And so we are seeing a big number of women who have left the labor force and aren't returning right now because of this change. The other group that Mark already mentioned that I want to highlight again is undocumented workers. Undocumented workers make up an estimated 3 to 5% of the total workforce in Massachusetts and are ineligible for unemployment benefits or any financial assistance from the federal government, including those stimulus checks that we received. And it's really hard to have government coordinated efforts to assist this group because they're undocumented. We don't necessarily know where these groups are. So there has been, leaders on the ground working to raise funds either through mutual aid or charity, but that's really not a sustainable way for folks to have been living over the past year. And the last group I'm going to highlight are what we're calling gig workers, or people who work for companies such as Uber or Amazon. They're employed as independent contractors, not as employees. And so they're sort of in this middle ground. And one thing that has happened during the pandemic that is new is that these workers, for the first time, were eligible for a benefit that's very similar to unemployment insurance called the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. And for the first time, these workers were eligible to apply for assistance to cover their lost wages when they lost their jobs. And I think we need to think about, as we go into recovery, what sorts of protections need to be in place for these workers, whose responsibility is that? Because even if folks go back to work during the pandemic, these workers are still largely unprotected, especially those who work gigs for cash or don't document their tip income. They have a really difficult time applying for any sort of benefit. And this chart shows some data from a survey that was done on Uber, Lyft, Postmates drivers, people who drive for this gig economy. And nearly a third of the respondents said that more than 75% of their household income comes from these jobs. So a lot of people think about these jobs as being sort of extra pocket money for someone, but what we're finding from survey data is that this really is the primary job for lots of households across the country and across our state. So I just talked about how the pandemic really impacted workers disproportionately across our state. But I also want to talk a little bit about what was happening before the pandemic and things for us to think about as we go into recovery, some of the issues that were already plaguing our society that we might want to fix. The first is wage polarization, which I'm sure you hear that term come across your desks pretty often. But since the 1990s, the number of middle income working households in Massachusetts has fallen, while low and high income working households are growing. And this is sort of due to four different key regions. One is a decline in middle income occupations, sort of the core of what we thought would sort of be middle income in the past. Things like maintenance and repair or farming and fishing, those jobs have really declined in our state. Another reason that we're seeing this wage polarization is low income growth and middle income decline in specific occupations, such as healthcare support or building and grounds maintenance. The only growth in those sectors that we're seeing are in low wage jobs. We also have disproportionate low income growth in jobs like food preparation or personal care, and disproportionate high income growth in things like the sciences and education. So what we're seeing is this really big polarization where you have households that are making very little money and households that are making a lot of money and very few people in between. Another shift we were seeing before the pandemic was a shift of MetroBoston into an innovation economy. And we define innovation economy as sort of an economy based off of ideas and thought rather than like a particular product or service. The Massachusetts Housing Partnership did a study a few years ago that found that about 15% of the greater Boston workforce was employed in this economy, which is the second highest concentration after Silicon Valley. But we actually are in a pretty unique position that we're not just concentrated in big tech. We have biomedical research, we have technology research, and then we also have higher education. And so we're well positioned in this economy to sort of fare no matter what's happening in the markets. However, other metro regions across the country are doing a better job at recruiting workers. Places like Austin, Texas, or Denver, Colorado have been attracting folks over the past decade or so by saying, we have a lower cost of living, come move here. And the housing crisis in Metro Boston is really putting a damper on some of the growth in this economy. We also saw very large inequities before the pandemic, and the pandemic only made them worse. But I want to point out a few key statistics that were in our State of Equity in Metro Boston report that was published a few years ago. So one is unemployment rates. The unemployment rates for Black workers in Metro Boston were nearly double what they were for white workers before the pandemic, and this has only gotten worse. And then for disabled workers, they're nearly 3 times the amount. And these are only for people who are still looking for employment. And we know that disabled workers are often discouraged from looking for employment and leaving the labor force in general. So these inequities are pretty stark. We also have an unequal opportunity based off of education. White non-Latino residents in Metro Boston were more than twice as likely to have a bachelor's degree than their Black or Latino counterparts. And this has implications for which types of jobs and opportunities are available to folks. And again, we have this unequal opportunity just in terms of even digital access, which has been a huge point during the pandemic. But the data from before the pandemic showed that by municipality, there's really big differences in how many people have access to online, any of the opportunities that are available online. And 3 factors sort of determine if people have digital access. It includes a connection to the internet, an adequate device, which could be, an iPad or a laptop or even a phone, and then literacy, so the ability to understand how to use it. And this chart only shows a few municipalities from our region, but you could see that before the pandemic in Lynn, nearly 20% of households did not have internet access, which as the pandemic hit, provided a lot of challenges for those households as they were unable to access connection to a lot of resources and family and friends. The last thing I want to point out is climate change, and it's too big of a subject to put on one slide, but that's what we did. When we're thinking about recovery, we really need to think about what's coming. And climate change is one of those big things that we have to grapple with. So the MAPC did a project a few years ago where we talked to workers who are already experiencing major changes in their jobs due to climate change. We talked to people working in the fishing industry, in agriculture, in even personal care. And people were telling us we're seeing changes in our jobs already. The way I did my job 10 years ago is not the way I can do my job now. And so as we think about recovery and what our new economy looks like, we really need to think about how climate change will change the way that we do everything. So I think that's a really good segue into this last section before I hand it over to Betsy, which is the things that we know are coming that haven't happened yet. How do we prepare for our future as we think about recovery? What are the things that we know will be happening in the next few years? The first is shifting demographics. So baby boomers made up about 50% of the region's labor force in 2010. Those folks have already started to retire or will be retiring in the next decade. And so we need to think about how to support and uplift young workers who are entering the labor force, perhaps without a lot of knowledge behind them or a lot of years of experience. This chart on the right also shows the share of people of color in the MAPC region going back to 1990. So in 2000, our region was about 20% people of color, and we anticipate that to be over 40% in 2040. And we just showed you some charts about the current disparities in unemployment rates and educational attainment rates. And if we allow those current disparities by race and ethnicity to persist, that's really a disservice to everyone across the state and especially to those communities. So we really need to think about that as we're fixing those inequities today. I'm also going to highlight just a few key industries that I think we should be thinking about for the future because the needs will change. The first is care work, which we've already seen a massive highlight on this industry due to the pandemic. The work is often low wage and unpredictable. This could be home health aides. This could be people who work in nursing homes. It could be people who work in childcare. A lot of people in these industries say they have a lack of control over their schedule, which makes it really difficult for them to plan their own lives and their own childcare. And these occupations have been losing high income jobs over the past few decades, and the only growth that we're seeing is in low income positions. So we really need to think about how we value this work, what kind of training is needed, and how we can make sure the people in this work are well supported and available. The other industry that I want to highlight that's particularly important for Metro Boston is higher education. So recent data in the past year has shown the number of folks applying for college and university in Massachusetts is down. And that number is down even more in high schools that have the most low-income students and students of color. So we're seeing people potentially put off going to college or maybe deciding not to go to college at all, which isn't necessarily a problem, but then we need to think about what other types of training and jobs, good paying jobs are available for folks because we don't have that great pipeline right now. The cost of higher education is still rising. Student loan debt is something that we've been talking about for a long time. And we really need to figure out this balance between training a future workforce, allowing workers to sort of have the training they need without a ton of debt, but also be able to find the jobs that they need. And Betsy will talk a little bit about that. And, as we're in Metro Boston, it's really important for us to think about what is our future as a region, as a higher education hub. We are seen as one of the higher education capitals of the country. And if higher education starts declining as an industry, what does that mean for Metro Boston? And another key trend that we know will be coming in the next decade or further is automation. There's a lot of disparities in the research about what people think can and can't be automated. I think the research sort of shows that most occupations can't be entirely automated, but many pieces of our jobs could be automated. So things like data collection or data processing or predictable physical work might be automated in the future. But the skills that we need, like human connection or emotional intelligence, probably have a low risk of automation. Those aren't the skills that are necessarily valued monetarily in our marketplace right now. And so we have to figure out what that balance is, again, as we're training workers and as we're thinking about how we value jobs in the marketplace. The last thing I want to talk about is telecommuting, because I'm sure we'll get questions about it if I don't talk about it. So we are all on this call from Zoom, but it's still really hard to know what this will look like in a year. Telecommuting and remote work was already increasing before the pandemic, but at a pretty low rate. This map shows the percentage of workers in 2018 who worked from home. And in most areas, it's about 5 to 10%. Surprisingly, in the seaport of Boston, it's nearly 30%, which I think is an interesting fun fact. But post-recovery, we might see different patterns emerge where remote workers are deciding to locate in their homes or where, especially across the state, I think outside of our region. And we have been listening to folks who are asking people on the ground what they want as things start to open up and become safer. The MBTA and MassDOT did a survey of employers, and about 70% of organizations said that they'd most likely allow 1 to 2 days of telework post-pandemic. And then when a different survey done by A Better City asked workers what they wanted, about 70% of folks said that they wanted to telework 1 to 2 days a week or more after the pandemic. So I think that number is matching up. Again, this is really only for folks who are able to telework. And so we, our jobs most of the time can be done from a desk. There are lots of jobs like sanitation workers or childcare workers who can't do their jobs remotely. And so when we think about changing transportation needs, especially around rush hour and commuting, we really need to think about the jobs that can't be done remotely and how we're servicing those workers in terms of their ability to get to and from work, their ability to bring their kids to and from childcare, etc. So I am going to pass it over to Betsy now to talk about our response at MAPC and things that we're hoping the state does in response going forward.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So I'm the Chief of Economic Development here, and I'm going to go through, really transition us now into talking about, so what do we do? And I'm assuming that's why you're all here today, based on all of that data that you're digesting. And I'll just put a plug in. If you have questions about the data that was just presented, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you have questions about, so what do we do? Please feel free to put those in the chat as well. So as Rep. Meschino mentioned earlier, we see a once in a generation opportunity to make investments through federal and state funding sources. We may or may not be using Hamilton references lately. We don't want to throw away our shot. We really think this is a huge opportunity. So the guidance for state and local ARPA funding was just released yesterday. I'm guessing you and your staff are digesting it, as are we. And so we're figuring out kind of how we use that funding, but that really is a huge opportunity, along with policy changes, to make sure that we're advancing equitable and resilient recovery. And when we say resilience, we really mean, how do we help the region prepare for future shocks? So this was certainly an unexpected shock, but now I think we have more capacity to predict some future shocks. And then how do we address equity? So all the data that Sarah presented around how this pandemic has certainly had unequal impacts on people around the region. So there are two planning processes that we've based our policy recommendations off of. And the first is MetroCommon, and we'll put another link in the chat so you all can provide guidance and feedback on our policy recommendations. This is looking out 30 years and really helping the region think through what are the policies that we need to put in place so that we can address where we want to be in 30 years. The second is our comprehensive economic development strategy. So this is a 5-year plan that we released at the beginning of this year, and really is our plan for recovery for the region. And there's kind of 3 major pillars. So the first is building financial security. The second is addressing the racial wealth gap, which is significant throughout the state. And the third is really related to this presentation as well, facilitating work through expanding housing options near employment centers, improving our transportation system, and expanding digital access. So you go to the next slide. So these areas certainly were important before the pandemic, but over the past year, as noted by the data that Sarah just presented, these issues are more important than ever, again, to ensure an equitable and resilient recovery. And I'll just note, all of these are important for the future of work and ensuring equity. So when we talk about economic development, we say housing is an economic development tool, transportation is an economic development tool, and the list goes on. So first, I'll talk about housing, and Lizzie's going to get more into the policy recommendations around this. But I'll just say certainly stable housing we've noticed is a major issue. And again, thinking about how do we help people get back into the workforce, having stable housing is critical. Second, certainly the need for investments in our transportation system. As Sarah noted, there's some uncertainty around how folks are going to return to work, but it's clear that they are going to return to work in some form, that the commuting patterns might change, but certainly being able to invest in our transportation system to make sure that it's affordable and reliable, but also flexible is critical. And so making investments now will help us ensure that folks can get back to work well. Workforce development is crucial. It was crucial before the pandemic, before we were certainly addressing issues of shortage of workers. Now there are actually, interestingly, shortage of workers in certain key industries that are expanding. But also, as Sarah mentioned, if we are in an innovation economy, there are certainly pipeline and supply chain opportunities across the spectrum of education requirements that would increase our equity in terms of who is able to access jobs. And so making significant investments in workforce development is crucial right now in terms of biotech, manufacturing, healthcare, IT, clean energy, and other industries. As Sarah mentioned, digital access is crucial, and ARPA, along with other federal and state bills, provides a significant opportunity to make investments. And I'll just mention, as Sarah mentioned, this is not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue, and it's not just about affordability, this is also about speeds. And so we've seen even residents of Everett, Revere, Chelsea, and other communities don't have the sufficient speed even to be able to access school or work. Childcare has become certainly an important issue. I know many of you are dealing it with yourselves personally, and your constituents are dealing with it. And we're thinking about not only ways to support the businesses to increase the supply of childcare providers, but also how do we support families that need to access childcare. And finally, healthcare, and really thinking about how do we make significant investments in our public healthcare infrastructure so that we can ensure, again, a more equitable and efficient recovery. So I'm now going to turn it over to Lizzie, who's going to talk about our policy priorities and the implications that this has for all of you.
Thanks so much, Betsy. I did actually was thinking we could open it to Q&A for just a little bit, and then I can wrap up with some of these specific policy recommendations that we have now. I see one question in the chat from Rep. Capano, and actually I also just want to recognize I've seen Rep. Howard, Rep. Kearns, Rep. Ehrlich, and I think another rep just joined, but I let them in the room too quickly before I could see who it was. Thank you again all for being here. But Rep. Capano's question is actually about manufacturing and how it's still a big part of the economy on the North Shore. It looks, he's asking about adult vocational training. And so Betsy, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about this piece.
Sure, I really appreciate the question. And I'll just note, we've been working with the North Shore Workforce Board to look at exactly that question. And really thinking about, especially with the strong mass hire workforce boards, how do we encourage more connection with the municipalities and the vocational schools that are within the municipalities and at the regional scale? You're right, manufacturing, particularly as I mentioned, across the supply chain for, say, healthcare. Norwood is now the home to Moderna's production facility for the vaccine. And those are jobs that allow for more flexible education requirements, and really see those as a ladder for people to advance in their career. So I'll just note, we're happy to provide more data on manufacturing, and we've been working with the North Shore Workforce Board, and we'll be supporting their work as they begin the workforce blueprint planning process, which is through the state skills cabinet, and really thinking about how do they now plan out for the next 3 years, the WIOA investments at the federal level, and then how do we help with the connection of all the other supports, the housing, transportation, digital access to, again, ensure that people can access those jobs. I hope that answers your question.
Great, and I think Rep. Meschino had messaged me that she might also have a question. I want to see if she's, yeah, I see her unmuting.
Yeah.
Great.
So first of all, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. You do not disappoint. This is a tremendous amount of information that you sort of just laid out for us. And I mean, I always ask about climate, so forgive me for asking about it again here. But it does strike me that if we look at the pandemic and the impacts as an opportunity, as you said, and we're thinking about the recovery, the workforce development, and sort of the economic recovery. What are some real key opportunities that, as representatives, we can be thinking about for investments locally and regionally for resilience, but also for some of the mitigation work? I just didn't know if you wanted to speak to that a little bit more detail, Betsy, because it's one slide, but it is a big piece.
So I'll tackle the beginning of that, and then I'll turn it back over to Lizzie for further thinking around our clean energy and climate priorities. But I'll say there's a couple, and I appreciate that you looped in workforce. So certainly with the legislation that you and others worked on, there is significant funding now to think about professions in the clean energy sector. And that's going to require skills training. So how do we connect that with the workforce development programming, as you mentioned? I'll just note, for applicable for several communities on the call, that it might make sense to do a workforce development plan at the municipal level and think about ways that you're tying in residents that are either underemployed or unemployed, and tying them into the mass hire workforce boards so that they can take advantage of that. I think the second is that we're also seeing an opportunity for businesses in that sector. And especially now we're thinking about procurement priorities, public procurement for minority women business enterprises and other enterprises that have been disadvantaged traditionally. And so that involves both the supply. So how do we build up the supply of those companies? And then also, how do we think about our procurement process to open up those opportunities to other businesses? We're doing a small research project right now on how we build the capacity of those contractors to participate in clean energy contracts, but there's a lot to be done there. And so at the local level, how do you address procurement challenges, but then also how do you fund training programs for those businesses so they can build their capacity to contract? I'm going to turn it over to Lizzie to answer the additional elements of that question.
Sure, and it kind of tees up some of what we're going to talk about in sort of this recovery section. You know, I think we really sort of believe that all of these pieces actually need to be closely connected to each other. And actually, sorry, there we go. Sorry, the slide changed for a second. And so, you know, some of the specific policy recommendations that we would encourage the legislature to be thinking about would be around creating a climate infrastructure bank is one of the recommendations that we would suggest. I know this is an idea that's been talked about inside the State House and even at the federal level for a long time, but it feels like now is actually the right time, and maybe federal dollars actually give us an opportunity to make a down payment on something like an infrastructure bank to allow us to actually look into some of those decarbonization and resilience measures that we really want to try to pursue. And then we have another set of recommendations around essentially accelerating building decarbonization and, like Betsy said, that decarbonization workforce. And then obviously some recommendations around increasing on the funding side. That won't be a surprise on the capital investment side, but I'll go into that a little bit in just another minute. Let's see, another question. Let's see, any study into a guaranteed minimum income and how it would help the rapidly changing workforce? I'm wondering, Sarah or Betsy, if you have any insight into that piece.
We haven't done any research on it ourselves, but I think that all of our research points to the need for a stronger safety net. And that is definitely one approach that we don't have plans to do specific research on ourselves, but we'd be happy to compile research if folks have more questions about that. And then Lizzie, I might throw it back to you because I do think that is something in our MetroCommon policy agenda that has been proposed and could be something that as a possibility to look more into, especially after the experiment in Chelsea.
Yeah, so Chelsea has a universal basic income pilot that they're working on now. And we've heard actually across the Commonwealth that other municipalities are looking at modeling after that UBI pilot in Chelsea. And it isn't actually something we're touching on in our MetroCommon recommendations today, but we do actually have that as one of our recommendations inside MetroCommon to actually start to do a little bit of research as a Commonwealth about what places have done a minimum or basic income pilot already and sort of how that outcome has been, and then to potentially actually start implementing it here in the Commonwealth as well. So I want to see if there are any more questions on sort of the data piece. And if not, I'm happy to talk about some of to shift over to the policy recommendations. All right. So on the policy side, so all of this work ties into the work that we are doing for the update to our regional plan, MetroCommon. And, you know, when we started off doing MetroCommon, we actually started off doing this work about 3 years ago. None of us would have even known what COVID was. And so we kind of started off doing the plan and thinking about this longer term timeline, which we're used to thinking about as planners. But as we transitioned to remote work fully at MAPC during COVID, we realized that a lot of our policy recommendations were ultimately going to be recovery recommendations for the legislature, for the administration, and for our cities and towns who have obviously a lot of local governance oversight to be thinking about. And so we ended up, we sort of created, because again, we're planners, we sort of created two sets of recommendations. So we have the MetroCommon policy recommendations, which really take us through about a 10-year timeline. And then we pulled out those recommendations that we felt like would actually have the greatest possible impact on leading us towards an equitable economic recovery. And so I just want to highlight a few of those for you today. We broke them into three buckets, which you can see on the slides. We're talking about workforce development and small businesses, making sure that these recovery goals align with climate, housing, and transportation. It's that really integrated approach that we think is going to give us the strongest recovery possible. And then improving our connectivity across our digital and public health infrastructure. And we really spotlighted on those two pieces because it was so clear during the pandemic that we were lacking there. And I will just note on that one, a lot of people kind of feel that those issues are different for rural communities, but we actually also saw it even in some of our most urban communities, that access to public health and access to digital infrastructure were seriously lacking. If we can go to the next slide. So these are the four recommendations that we've highlighted under our workforce development and small business support that we think will actually really help propel us into recovery. I should also note that whenever we're making policy recommendations at MAPC, we often have to make sure that all of our recommendations don't just boil down to let's print more money, because we recognize that that is not a feasible request of the legislature, that's not in your purview. So we really try to drill down on those things that we feel like can actually have some sort of legislative change. So on that first one, on the workforce board, and kind of shifting the way that we think about those, there's really two recommendations there. The first is kind of reevaluating the workforce board so that they actually better reflect our current demographics and our current economic conditions. And then the second recommendations under that first one is really around making sure that high need communities are grouped together so that they can actually receive a larger portion of the state's workforce investment budget. And so even though we're not necessarily trying to print money for all these recommendations, sometimes we're actually trying to better align the structures that exist so that the neediest entities can actually take advantage of dollars that are already available. The second recommendation is actually one we've been talking about a lot, particularly under COVID, thinking about the fact that we will expect to see some kind of change through our commercial spaces, and potentially allowing for some ease of zoning changes, that Z word that everyone hates, to make sure that we can actually take advantage of the spaces that become available and think of creative reuse opportunities so that we don't just have really vacant properties in our communities. This third recommendation around the workforce skills cabinet is, again, about kind of better integrating that cabinet so that we have additional secretariats that are then included inside the cabinet so that we can actually have that more intersectional perspective as we're thinking about our workforce needs in the Commonwealth. And then the last recommendation really is about dollars. And again, I do think some of these are opportunities where we could use federal dollars to really try to help jumpstart us and make these investments. But we would really encourage an expansion of the Mass Office of Business Development pilot grant program beyond its expiration. It'll expire in June of 2021, and we would love to see that work continue. The next recommendation under funding would be around continued technical assistance directed at small businesses. Betsy talked about this, especially those businesses that advance equity, environmental justice, and climate resilience. And then the last funding recommendation here would be about providing supports for small businesses that transition to a cooperative or employee-owned model, employee ownership model. And we've just seen that there's a lot of new evidence that cooperatively owned businesses actually are really successful. And so we'd love to see some pilot and some investment in those types of businesses. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about this in response to Rep. Meschino's question. And again, this is where we want to make sure that all of our recovery goals are actually really aligned with each other, so that they're actually talking to each other and advancing all the Commonwealth's goals at the same time. So again, I highlighted the Climate Infrastructure Bank. MAPC has long called for increased dollars for planning, capital, and operating funds for public transit. I think that one is particularly true as we think about federal infrastructure dollars that might be coming down sometime in the next year or so, that we want to actually really be ready for those. And so that means we need to be doing some of that planning work right now. The legislature actually set us up really, really well for that, for the first recommendation in this section around the setting incentives and mandates to accelerate building and transportation decarbonization with the climate bill that just passed. We really feel like we can actually make some strides on that. And so again, this is an opportunity where recovery dollars might actually give us a chance to actually set some of those good policies in place to really see that legislation through. We talk at MAPC a lot about reducing barriers to housing production. And so we would love to be able to see policy incentives that actually help to build on the recently passed housing choices legislation, and particularly the provision there that would require municipalities to zone multifamily districts near MBTA stations. And we want to make sure that guidance actually takes a really holistic approach. And then the last recommendation in this section is, again, it's another money one. It's about increasing funding for rental assistance, utility bill assistance, and supportive services. And even though I have not gone through all 151 pages of the interim guidance on the ARPA dollars, this does seem like it will actually be a truly acceptable use under those funds. And so we are going to be working with cities and towns to help them think through what types of projects they should be actually investing in on the local level. Next slide. So as I mentioned, these two areas around digital divide and public health infrastructure were two places where we really saw across the Commonwealth. And again, MEPC ended up working with a lot more than just our 101 cities and towns during the height of the pandemic. And these twin issues on digital issues and public health access and access to infrastructure, really we saw across the board in some of our most urban communities and some of our most rural communities. We are doing a lot of work on digital divide issues at MAPC right now. And again, I do think that these will end up being acceptable use dollars under the new ARPA dollars that came down for communities. And so we're going to be helping communities think through how they can take a regional approach to those dollars. The public health infrastructure, this is, again, the legislature has really done a lot on this, on trying to lift up local public health. And we really feel like there are opportunities, again, for a regional approach to public health where cities and towns can be working together to think about some of their public health needs and address them in a regional way. And then that middle recommendation about opportunities to connect with local government, we really saw that there's just an unbelievable response to public meetings when people could participate remotely. And we want to make sure that we have opportunities for that public participation to continue because we actually felt like there was a big increase in participation that actually led to seeing a more diverse participation in our public meetings. And so there are a number of pieces of legislation that are under consideration right now that would allow cities and towns to actually continue some of that public participation in an innovative way. And we want to make sure that we're thoughtful about that as we move forward. So you can find all of these recommendations and more inside our MetroCommon policy recommendations. That is literally the fastest possible overview I could give all of you today. And we'll include another link for you to weigh in. We need all of you not only to weigh in yourselves with your own thoughts about these recommendations, but also to help us with outreach to your constituents to ask them what they think. Because at the end of the day, we're making policy recommendations and planning recommendations that really affect all of the residents who live in our region and honestly, pretty far beyond our region. So I think that is all that we actually have planned for you today. We have like 2 more minutes. If anyone has a pressing question, we'd be happy to go through it. Let's see. All right. So I think that's it. Rep, do you want to wrap us up?
Absolutely. So again, I just want to thank MAPC for all of its hard work on behalf of our communities in the metro subregion, but the whole state. MAPC represents about half, I think 3.2 million people in 101 communities, and is weighty among its peers. And I want to thank all of the representatives who spent time with us in person today. It's super busy right now, and I really appreciate not just your staff coming on and taking time to listen and ask great questions, but also for the representatives who made time to come in person as well. I know what that meant today. It was a lot going on. I would just say that in closing, I think that the value of MAPC's work is obvious, and I would just encourage you to avail yourselves of them, of their expertise and their knowledge and their data and their planning. And I just want to thank Mark Drazen for being such a terrific long-term leader of this organization, and for all his fantastic staff. And I just hope everyone has a great day and that everyone stays healthy and safe.
Thank you so much. We'll be sending out some follow-up materials, so stay tuned. Really appreciate everyone. Thank you.